Good afternoon. The show is Diaspora Dispatches, and on today's show, we are going to Sudan and we look at that political agreement deal that was signed last year in December, and so far what it has been able to achieve and why it raised a lot of tensions and what that could have meant even for the military leadership there in Sudan. So a topic of discussion, or the question that we shall be looking to engage in this afternoon, is what the emerging rivalry between the military leaders and what that could mean for Sudan. They seem to be speaking from different sides of the coin, and we know that the side of the civilians is not actively a part of that transitional government anymore. So what are these struggles that are ongoing in the military ranks there, and what this portends for the stability and also for the transition of Sudan? Thank you so much. My name is Miriam Ogutu. The Sudanese military and a coalition of major civilian actors signed a framework agreement on the 5th of December 2022, paving a path to a new civilian government more than a year after the military seized full power in October 2021 coup. Now, this was the second coup that happened. Remember, the first coup happened in 2019 that disposed former President Omar al-Bashir. And then there was a transitional government that had 11 members in this in its governance system, 5 of which were from the military side and 6 were from civilian side. So this coup that happened in 2021 removed the acting prime minister at that time, Abdallah Hamdok, and so this is the coup that we are referring to this afternoon. While the New Deal has raised hopes and indeed that Sudan's long political impasse could be nearing an end, it has also received its fair share of criticism. Many view the negotiations as too exclusive, and the deal therefore excludes former rebels and others without broader support. Many have argued that a new government could ultimately lack legitimacy. Now, in case you're wondering what are part of this framework, what did it entail, what are some of the things that were involved, and the reason why this deal was criticized so much, it is because it is the military that spearheaded these talks and came out with this deal. And so the civilian side felt they were left out, and some of the things they would have wanted included in this framework were not there because their opinion was not sought, and that's why it raised a lot of criticism and sort of lacks the legitimacy as far as the civilian side is concerned. So the Sudanese political parties and the military signed a framework deal, as I have said, in December last year, and this they said would pave a way for a 2-year civilian-led transition. So this is part of the agreement that was included in that framework deal that they signed in December. And you wonder, why would they want to add themselves another 2 years at the helm of the country when Omar al-Bashir was disposed in 2019, around April, I believe. In August of that year, when this transitional government was formed with 11 members, as I have mentioned there, the agreement was for this transitional government to be in power for 3 years as they worked for modalities on how to transit and later hand over back the leadership of Sudan to the civilian rule. So that was the agreement. And so towards the near end of this 3-year transition period, we saw the military sort of acting up, and I think if you have been following our conversations around this matter, it was clear that the military were not really preparing to hand over power because of several other factors that we've kept talking about here, and one of which has to do with the issue of Darfur that got former President Omar al-Bashir indicted, and also he has a warrant of arrest over that issued by the International Criminal Court over his involvement in that, or because that happened during his tenure as the president of Sudan. And we well know that top or majority of the top leadership, the military leadership in Sudan, served during Omar al-Bashir's time. So essentially, taking Omar al-Bashir to the ICC would mean majority of these military juntas might also find themselves in trouble as far as the ICC Omar al-Bashir's case is concerned. So that is one of the reasons why they have been reluctant on that. And I think their fear with that matter is, should they hand over the leadership of the country to the civilian side, then there are possibilities that the civilian side was willing to actually cooperate with the ICC and to see another investigation happen into the ICC. The current what do you call him? I've forgotten, but Karim Khan, chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, just released a report a few weeks ago to the United Nations, and he was just giving a status update as far as that case is concerned, because sometimes back last year he had said that the ISIS has intentions of setting up a shop in Sudan and starting its investigations afresh over the killings of Darfur. And I think I laughed that off personally, because I knew there's no way the military was going to actually coordinate and work with him to investigate them. You know, they were the ones who were in charge. Omar al-Bashir led by the military when he was in power. He's a former military leader, and he led a majority of the things that are done in Sudan, quite militarized. And so for Karim Khan to have imagined that this group of transitional leaders were going to support his idea of setting up an office of the ICC and to start investigating those cases, that was never going to happen. So I think this is among other reasons as to why they could be reluctant to hand over power to the civilians. And so towards the end of this transitional period, the 3-year period, the initial 3 years period, we started seeing year 2, the military really posturing itself and making the other side uncomfortable until the key leaders in the civilian side, others had to back off, others resigned, others walked away in protest of how the military was strong-handed in the manner in which it was choosing to run the country without necessarily factoring in the civilian side. So I needed also to explain that, and that's why I was wondering why in this new framework deal in December they decided to add themselves another 2 years, contrary to the initial agreement that they had signed in August 2019, just a few months after Omar al-Bashir had been removed in power. And even in these 2 years that they've added here as a 2-year civilian-led transition, they're working towards a civilian election. I doubt if this is just, I think this is just another delay tactics, and there's no telling if at all they'll not be able to keep moving this goalpost as far as just their interest is concerned. So I think this a 2-year transition period that they added to themselves also was very controversial, and this among other issues really that led to the protests that we've been seeing against this framework. Now, several thousand people protested against the deal in the capital, Khartoum. Immediately it was signed, with some facing off against security forces who fired tear gas and stun grenades away from the signing ceremony. So while the signing ceremony was taking place, also protest from civilians was also taking place outside of that. And under the framework deal, the military in charge since the coup agreed it will only be represented on a Security and Defense Council headed by a Prime Minister. Now, the outline pact set no date for a final agreement, and this is the loophole that the civilian side and the people of Sudan were saying. It's not definite. They did not set a date or the appointment of the Prime Minister, and left very sensitive issues including transitional justice and security sector reform for further talks. Okay, so they were not clear. So as much as they signed this deal, they were not clear as to when the new Prime Minister was going to be appointed. So it was very opaque in the manner in which some sensitive issues that the other side would have wanted for it to be captured would be captured. So these areas which are very sensitive were left very opaque, and this essentially giving the military latitude to operate with within this ambiguity, and to perhaps take advantage and do whatever it is according to their interpretation of how this deal, the final agreement, looked like. like. And the deal could mark a new phase for Sudan, at least that is what was thought at that time, but has already faced resistance from protest groups opposed to negotiations with the military and from Islamist factions loyal to the regime of top leader Omar al-Bashir. And the signing of the framework agreement marked the first step in the two-phase process. Though describing it as important breakthrough, there, of course, are some issues that are contentious and that will need to be addressed in the final accord, and that has not happened yet. And they include security sector reform, as I've mentioned there, some of the issues that were left out ambiguously, and the merger of forces, how that was going to work, transitional justice, and the implementation of the 2020 Juba Peace Agreement signed by the transitional government and several armed groups in Darfur. And those talks are being led by South Sudan's President Salva Kiir. And so part of that, because of the instability that has been ongoing in Sudan itself, has stalled this process. But there is a deal that was signed in Juba that is yet to be implemented. And so these are the things that also the civilian side and a part of the transitional justice we're hoping would be captured and proper procedures in how they're going to be implemented laid down. But you see, a lot of these things would require a lot of compromise and giving away of certain powers from the military. So these are things they are not going to agree to, and because they are the ones who actually prepared this document, and that's why they left these very sensitive issues. I think it was very intentional in the manner in which that was left out. So that was just a bit of background on why we are now this afternoon discussing the emerging rivalry between the military leaders and what this could mean to Sudan in the present and also in the near future. Now, the emerging rivalry between the two top military leaders in Sudan could play into the plan of pro-democracy forces who want a return to civilian rule. Deputy head of the Sovereign Council, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, alias Hemedi, appears to have had a change of heart over the October 2021 coup, the one I've explained to you that toppled the Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok from the civilian side of the transitional government, and is now a leading voice in calling for the return of civilian rule. And remember, while they were toppling this, or they have been speaking in the same voice for the deputy head of the Sovereign Council, who appears to be more powerful than the head of that council, has now come out, and I think in the recent past that you're having this conversation here, and they're saying, oh, I think that coup that happened in October was a mistake. And at that point, I wondered, why would he come out and make such an admission? Does it mean there could be some problems out there within the military leadership, or what could be the issue here? Turns out, might have been right at that point. Now, this has not gone down well. After he came out and made this admission, this did not go well with the head of the Sovereign Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is really uncomfortable over his call for the immediate implementation of the political framework agreement. This that was signed in December, because as I've been explaining, there are aspects of this agreement that were left to be ambiguous and did not give a time frame. So what Hemedi, the second in command in the military side, is saying, can we hasten with the implementation of this agreement, and which is supposed to return the country to democracy? But al-Burhan is uncomfortable, and al-Burhan, I guess, on his side, is trying to buy as much time as possible for reasons I've explained there in the few minutes earlier there, and among other reasons. Okay, so on March the 7th, General Dagalo surprised many Sudanese when he called on the army to hand over power to civilians and vowed to resist those who want to cling to power. Clearly, the army is not speaking with one voice there, and that, I think, speaks to a much deeper problem that perhaps what we see, even for him to come out and speak like that in public, perhaps speaks of even a bigger problem that is deep-seated within the leadership in the army, especially. So earlier this month, a couple of days ago, Dagalo came out again and said, hey, I think we are overstaying our stay. We should be marching back to the barracks. We had the 3 years transitional period. It's about time. Why are we adding another 2 years on the transition? We need to work the modalities very quickly and implement this political framework agreement and have the army go back to the barracks and let the civilian rule the country. So he's saying, he is vowing to resist those who want to cling to power. And those who want to cling to power, of course, are the other side of the army. And I think majority of this are loyalists of former President Omar al-Bashir. He is. He worked with former President Omar al-Bashir. Matter of fact, he heads over the Janjaweed militia group that now has a new name. It's called Sudan Rapid Force, and so he is part and parcel of that. So for him to have changed tune like this and now is willing to have a transition, and he's saying he will resist if I guess his boss decides he wants to cling to power a little bit longer. He says he'll fight every attempt of that. So that spells out a much bigger problem in Sudan that we probably even have knowledge of. And let me just quote what he said in Karari, that is north of Khartoum, on the 7th of March. He said, "We said with all our will that the power to be handed over to fully fledged civilian government." So he said that, and he reiterated. And earlier in February, General Dagalo, who is the commander of the notorious Rapid Support Forces, that is the RSF, the former Janjaweed, ruffled feathers within the top military leadership when he said that the October 2021 coup was a mistake and urged the military to hand over powers to the civilians. So in case you're wondering how that coup happened, let me just see if I can remind us the events that led to the removal of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, that now Hemedi, the second in command of the Sudan military force there, is saying that was a big mistake the military did. Now, on October 25th, 2021, the Sudanese military, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, took control of the government in a military coup, and at least 5 senior government figures were initially detained. Civilian Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok refused to declare support for the coup, and on the 25th of October called for a popular resistance. He was moved to a house arrest on the 26th of October. Remember, he actually was under house arrest in General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's house, and he came out later to say he was just providing protection for the Prime Minister. Interesting. And during that time, there was internet outages which were reported, and later the same day, the Sovereignty Council was dissolved, and the Sovereignty Council is what had all this, had brought together the transitional government from the civilian side and the military side. So all this happened at the same time, and a state of emergency was put in place, and a majority of the Hamdok cabinet and a number of pro-government supporters were arrested. And as of the 5th of November 2021, the list of those detained included government ministers, members of political parties, lawyers, civil society activists, also journalists, human rights defenders, and protest leaders who were held in secret locations without access to their families or lawyers. And during that time, also key civilian groups, including the Sudanese Professional Association, the Forces of Freedom and Change, called for civil disobedience and refusal to cooperate with the coup organizers, and protests started on the 25th and the 26th of October. All these are happening at the same time against the coup, and at least 10 civilians were reported as being killed and over 140 injured by the military during the first day of the protest. And protests and strikes continued, with 200,000 to 2 million protesters participating around Sudan on October the 30th, and 15 shot dead by security forces in protest organized by the Sudanese resistance committees. And these deaths were reported on the 17th of November. So this is just a breakdown on what exactly happened during that October coup that now Dagalo, or Hemedi, has come out to say that was a big mistake. So now General Dagalo has said that his RSF has no dispute with the army, but rather with those who want to cling to power. It is now emerging that there is a power struggle between General Dagalo and General Al-Burhan, with some analysts attributing to General Dagalo's close links with Russia. We've seen the trips that he's been making, the second in command, very close to Russia, and that are angling more significant influence in Sudan. So that could be one aspect of it. And while General Dagalo is agitating for the immediate handover to civilian rule, General Al-Burhan has maintained that more political players should join the framework agreement to allow broader representation, and that security sector reforms can only be undertaken by the government that will be elected. So I don't know why he wants to have more civilians come. I think he's looking for people that perhaps will side with him from the civilian side. So I'm thinking they'll just look for the people who maybe are in support of the military and plant them here. So when they go to these meetings, they have sort of what they look like as civilian support, but in essence, it's not. So because why would he not want? Why would he want more civilians to be included here for a broader framework? While the initial framework was very clear, and the number of people who are participating in this transitional government also was very clear from the start. But instead, after that coup, even that council was dismissed, and so now he wants to form another one with more civilians in there, and that is also another point of departure that he's having with his deputy. Now already the Forces of Freedom and Change, FFC, this is an opposition this is an outfit which led the protest that ousted former President Omar al-Bashir in 2019, was forced to come out and clarify they are not siding with General Dagalo and his RSF. Khalid Omar, the official spokesperson for the civilian forces in the political process, issued a statement denying claims that there is an alliance between RSF commander and FFC leaders to push for a speedy return to the civilian role. He attributed the claims to elements of the former al-Bashir regime that are out to cause division between progressive forces in the military and civilians so as to prolong the military rule. So in all sides, nobody is supporting this overstay of power by the military in Sudan. However, General Dagalo is currently under the radar of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency over his close ties with Russia and the RSF operations in the diamond and gold mines in the neighboring Central African Republic. Now, this rapid Sudan forces, the RSF, the former Janjaweed militia group with a new outfit now, you'll be interested to know is also present, and part of that chaos you see in the Central African Republic, and this seems to be working in cahoots with the Russian mercenaries over there. So because of that, General Dagalo has been under the radar of the U.S. surveillance. Now the RSF is collaborating with the Russian paramilitary firm Wagner Group to control of the Vakanga diamond mines in the Central African Republic, which has attracted the attention of these Western powers. See, and also another reason that could be causing this a crack within the military is also the issue of Sudan and Israel discussing establishing relationships with Sudan and Israel, for a long time. Sudan being part of the Arab League, there was an agreement which actually was agreed upon in Sudan in 1967, and the general consensus was all the countries in the Arab League were to severe. There were three fundamental no's that were agreed upon in principle at that time in Khartoum in 1967, and the three was not to recognizing Israel as a state, not to having any diplomatic relations with Israel, and another no that I keep forgetting, but that was the general agreement. And so for Sudan to now look like they want to make they want to start mending and working on their ties with Israel, I think really is a move that perhaps many in the Arab world could not have seen coming. But I think not majority, but some of the countries in the Arab League have started warming up and sort of mending and having a bit of a diplomatic relationship with Israel. they've had an issue because of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and that's why they met in Khartoum in 1967 and agreed in principle to operate within those three no's against the state of Israel. Okay. Now, Sudan and Israel have intensified talks to establish ties in what could be expanding diplomatic victory for the Jewish state in the Arab world. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leader of Sudan Sovereignty Council, hosted Israeli Foreign Minister in Khartoum recently, where they discussed enhancing the prospects of joint cooperation, especially in the security and military fields. A statement issued by the Sovereignty Council said that al-Burhan met Cohen and his accompanying delegation in Khartoum in the presence of Sudanese Foreign Minister Ali Aladig. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz quoted an Israeli official who described this as a major event, saying that Sudan is preparing to sign an agreement to normalize relations with Tel Aviv. So this could also be another point of departure between these two leaders in the military leadership there in Sudan. So in the late 2020s, Israel and Sudan announced the normalization of the relations between them after the US President Donald Trump pledged to remove Sudan from the list of what Washington considers state sponsors of terrorism, which I think those are the few things that key things that actually Donald Trump did towards the end of his presidency, and provide aid to Khartoum. However, Sudan has not yet officially signed that agreement. I wonder why. And since that meeting between al-Burhan and Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Entebbe, Uganda in February 2020, the pace of normalization of the ties has accelerated. It is noteworthy that Sudanese army led the movement to normalize relations with Israel, while the civilian groups were more reluctant to do so. So the civilian group were more reluctant to do so. And I have a feeling even the second in command, perhaps in the military, Dagalo, was not very enthusiastic about the normalization of ties between Sudan and Israel because of the historical factors there that I've just glossed over. So this could be one of the reasons why, among others. So now, this emerging rivalry between military leaders could potentially place Sudan in a path where they might not be able to reconcile back to how they used to be and to have their stability fully. The problem when you have these countries that have experienced coup around Africa, you have these coups that happened, and then you have a military that has tasted power and is refusing to back down and wants to prolong its stay more than it's necessary. What usually happens, and this is what we're seeing playing out now they're sounding diplomatic, and you can see, and by the time Dagalo is coming out to make such statements in public, just you don't even know what is happening in the background, all right? By the time he's coming out to say that he is committed to making sure that the country transits very fast to civilian rule, you don't know the kind of disagreements that they're having in the background. So this is portends a serious instability problem for Sudan. Like I was saying, these countries that experienced coup, and these military leaders have refused to go back, to march back to the barracks. They pose another challenge, and one of them is a counter coup. We saw how that played out in Burkina Faso. I keep making reference to that because even within the military itself, they don't seem to operate within the same value system. They don't have the same ideas in how they want the country to be led, and that's why a military should not be leading any country. A military should be left to do its job, and that is protecting the sovereignty of the country and the people of the country, because they're unable to. They cannot be a unifying factor in a country, especially a country that has tasted democracy. Maybe in other autocratic countries that all they know is that. And so the fact that these military leaders still saw it important to keep staying in power, you see the 3 years elapsed, and now they've extended their reign with another 2 years. Between now and the end of these 2 years, you don't know what would have happened. And I think that is supposed to be ending next year, because this deal was signed in December. So I'm assuming if you were to go with their word, then they're supposed to organize for a transition between now and the end of December next year. Is that even possible? No. Are they even working towards getting to that point? No. South Sudan right now does not even have a constitution. Remember, after the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir, the first thing they agreed to do is to suspend the constitution and work on a new constitution and a new modality. So while they keep pushing, this transition time much farther, other things that are important are lagging behind, and one of them is the working on the constitutional making process, which is quite tedious and requires an atmosphere where there is soberness for them to come with a proper document that can lead Sudan in the future and for the prosperity of the country of Sudan. And so these are things that now have been held hostage and can't happen, among other things that are supposed to be happening, because they keep postponing this transitional time. Even come next year, I'm sure they'll have another excuse, and maybe towards the end of this year or at the beginning of next year, they'll start having problems, because I've said here and I repeat, these juntas in Sudan, in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, they're not interested in transiting. They're not interested in transiting and making sure that the countries are able to go back to the leadership of the civilians. And so I don't see this happening in Sudan. I would like for them to surprise me, but if you were to judge from the past, because that's how you project the future, you look at what has been the pattern from the past, then you can clearly say there's no commitment towards transition, towards handing power back to the civilians. Now, the problem with that is that the countries that are very precarious situation, because there is the danger of another counter coup, like I've said, and there is a danger of falling out. And when the military itself falls out and there is that crack, and now we're having that division, then that poses a serious danger for the stability of the country. That poses a serious danger. That's why a country like Zimbabwe, with all its problems, it was lucky after the removal of the late President Mugabe, the army went back to the military, and they allowed for the transition to happen, and an election happened after that. And we've never seen the military of Zimbabwe out there in the street and trying to be a part and parcel of that power struggle in Zimbabwe. And to some extent, with all its problems, Zimbabwe is relatively stable. It is. The same thing as Algeria. I keep referring to, after the army removed former President Bouteflika, we saw the army, which I think wrote him that statement that I totally think that that's what they did, and he was put there to read because, he had suffered a stroke and all that. And after that, the army marched back to the barracks. Now Algerians are fighting over their democracy and what they want that to look like and how they imagine that to look like. And there has been a tussle over that. But I've not seen the presence of army in the streets again. And so as much as there are these wrangles and these protests every now and then that I think COVID might have brought the end to them. They used to protest every Friday. But we've seen Algeria go back to stability, So that's what should have happened. But when you see these countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and now Sudan, with the military insisting on staying in power and keep postponing this transitional period and time, I think this is very selfish of these men and women in uniform. I've not seen even women, these men in uniform. Majority of them are men. I've not seen women around these juntas who have taken power. So let's just place it on men for right now. So they refuse to go back and they're insisting on staying in power. This has a potential to have these countries never know stability again. So for the better and for the good of the country in Sudan and these other African countries that have experienced coup, I think it will be prudent for them to hasten the processes of our transition so that the countries can go back to civilian rule and the army can go back to doing what army is known to do. And so that is the danger that portends, and that is what might mean. And this rivalry between the military leaders in Sudan, it is just more than just meet the eye. It's just more than these statements that are being made out here. There's more happening behind the scenes, and this poses even a greater danger. A divided military in a country sets the country to a very precarious path, and Sudan might never know stability ever again if these military juntas don't get their act together and let the transition happen as soon as possible. I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. My name is Miriam Agoto. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.